So Sila welcomes you wherever you are today to our conversation with Rashad Bayramov, and we're going to be talking about how to communicate more effectively in the COVID-19 world. And I thought I'd just kind of share a couple of things before we get started. First of all, I'm Bill Starnes, and I'm your host for our conversation today. And Rashad, one of my favorite quotes that I've come across is from a book called Conversations Worth Having by Sherry Torres and Jackie Stavros. And what they say in their book is that the conversations we have create the worlds we live in. And so obviously communication is really important, particularly to people in our networks who are leaders in their families, communities, and organizations. And it's hard enough to communicate sometimes in person, much less at a distance. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And so before we start, just a couple of logistical matters. Obviously, we're on a Zoom call. You have the chat, and so please use the chat for any questions you have. Aisha is behind the scenes, and she'll be collecting your questions and sharing them with me. So when we get to the Q&A, I can present those to Rashad for his feedback. We anticipate going maybe around an hour and 15 minutes altogether. We'll try to have our conversation in about 45 minutes or so, and then open up to Q&A. But if there are a lot of questions, we might go over the hour limit a little bit. There will be a recording, and Aisha's recording as we start the call. Now, with all of that in mind, let me introduce Rashad. So he's based in Baku. Rashad serves as British Petroleum, now BP's Modernization and Transformation Lead for Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. Rashad is also a consultant and trainer on communications, and he helps corporate clients to develop successful advertising strategies and communication platforms. And Rashad's considered to be one of the leading experts in communication and public speaking in Azerbaijan. So we have a real star with us today, and those of you who have met him, he's been a regular part of our faculty and at our more recent leadership development academies, and he gets like top ratings, raises the bar for all of us. So Rashad, before we get into communications, I'd like to kind of establish a little background, a little context around yourself. And so before we delve into that and how we're going to adapt to the COVID-19 world, let's start with some brief background. Tell us where you were born, where you grew up, and what you wanted to be as a child growing up.
Well, thank you, Bill. First of all, welcome to everyone who's joined us on this call. Pleasure to see so many familiar faces. Equally, thankful for everyone who I haven't met so far who decided to join this call and listen to how Bill and I will be sharing quite a lot of different opinions on what makes effective communication today. Well, as to your question, Bill, I was born and raised in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. I know you've been to Baku, right? At least once. So
it's an incredible city. It's an incredible city.
So I just say it's a sunny city on the shore of the Caspian Sea. Wonderful cuisine, and of course, great people. So in terms of, my upbringing was basically raised in a very traditional Azerbaijani family. My father was a breadwinner. My mother took look after her two kids, basically as a housewife, although she did graduate from university in particle physics. So it was kind of a tough decision for her to do that houseworks. But it did pay off because she spent an enormous amount of time with myself and my brother, and that actually helped build, I believe so, helped build our professional future in very many ways.
Great. Now, so what did you want to be growing up?
Good question. Well, probably as everybody, at some point in time, I wanted to be a fireman and a policeman and even an astronaut. But then probably close to the end of my school, it was about becoming a doctor, a medical doctor. And the reason was my father was a doctor, so kind of I wanted to follow suit. But I ended up picking the English language as my major in the university. And then I graduated as a teacher of the language. And that actually in itself has, in my view, that knowledge of the language has basically got me a ticket into professional life in many ways.
Interesting. So your background really from school is in English. And obviously your language is excellent, but you're now at BP, so you're in the oil industry, and I know I did a little research on you. I know you ended up studying at the Rochester Institute of Technology. So clearly you must have studied engineering there, right?
No,
No?
not right. So the way I got into Rochester Institute of Technology is also not quite usual. I mean, being from Azerbaijan, I studied in the University of Languages in my home country. I did a couple of years as an interpreter. And let me tell you this, Bill, I think my experience as a freelance interpreter shaped up so much my, not only knowledge of language, that was probably secondary right now, but knowledge of so many different industries to which I was pretty much attached for a couple of weeks or a couple of days to be with some really significant, influential people, politicians, businessmen, statesmen, and community leaders. And I was just out there translating from English into Azerbaijani and the other way around. So I learned a lot in those 2 years. And then obviously the way I went into Rochester was I understood very well that just the knowledge of language will take me so far, but then I needed to appropriate almost like a second profession, right? So, and I opted for communication. And that's how I applied for a scholarship with U.S. Department of State. And actually, you probably remember there was a time when there was this famous scholarship named after U.S. Senator Edmund Muskie. And that was the Edmund Muskie scholarship program, quite famous, quite known in the former Soviet Union. So I was one of the Muskie graduates, and that's how I got my ticket to study communication and media technologies in Rochester.
Awesome. Well, so what I was trying to kind of get at with your background a little bit is, when did you first become aware of the art and craft and power of communication, and sort of saw this as what you might want to dedicate your life to? Was this something? Was there a particular moment, or was it kind of a cumulative experience, being exposed to all these leaders and as you were translating? What was the trigger that said this is who I want to be?
Well, you know what? I want to tell you, I think I want to give you almost 3 steps. So number one, it happened when I was a little kid. I was actually probably 3 or 4. That's how far I can remember myself. And my inspiration was my grandmother. And my grandmother, she's 89 years old right now, so she's still alive, and is an amazing woman. And the reason I say it is because ever since I remember myself, I remember that she was this magnet who drew to herself all the relatives, all the neighbors. Just when she started talking, when she started speaking, everybody, stopped their stuff and just basically glued to listen to every single word that comes out of her mouth. And I always wondered, what's in it? What is she doing that actually is magnetic to people? So she was my first inspiration. And by the way, just to cut the story short, later on I understood she was a fantastic storyteller, but that's probably something we can talk separately. Second thing I was amazed to when I was growing up is stand-up comedy. I was so much amazed by stand-up comedians. I was born and raised in the Soviet Union, so I didn't really see a lot of American stand-up by probably the time I was already in university. But I was growing up in school years, a lot of Russian comedian, artists, etc. They just blew me away. They completely, the way they played with words, the way they worked with the audience, the way they, had that way of basically taking the audience and grabbing it and keeping their attention was amazing. And probably the third thing, and again, I was probably much more when I was sort of already in university and later, is I was watching politicians speak, both, our late president, Heydar Aliyev, the way he made speeches, and then more and more different politicians across the world, the way they presented their arguments to public. I was amazed. So I think those 3 things, my grandmother, stand-up comedy, and politicians were the 3 elements that kind of drove me on the road to the communication profession.
Awesome. That's really interesting. And so, again, this kind of goes back to one of the things we talk about sometimes in our leadership development programs is this whole idea of deliberate practice. And so obviously from a very early age, you've been observing, paying attention to, and then the exposure you've had in your career has made a big difference. And obviously you've mastered the elements yourself. So I don't know if the family conversations have changed a little bit now and everybody listens to you more than grandmother, but anyway, we won't get into that. But what I would like to talk about a little bit now before we segue into communication issues. Now, currently, you're with BP in the modernization and transformational lead for Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. And so, talk a little bit about your career path, how you got there, and what role your communication skills played in getting you into this position. Because as I understand it, this is a pretty high-level position. You've got 3 major countries. You're now engaged in a lot of strategic thinking and communications. Talk about your career path.
Yeah,
and in particular, the communication skills, the role it's played in helping you move through.
Absolutely. In fact, let me share with you a story of how I basically got hired to that position. Now, obviously, I went through an interview process just like you would do in any other company when there was a position. But I want to tell you how I was basically brought to the office of our CEO. And he told me, Rashad, I want to tell you something. This interview was da-da-da-da-da, and I think you're the best qualifying person for this particular role. And here's why. He says, I know that you're a passionate person, and I've seen so many times how you spoke with different people. So I want you to take that passion. I want you to take that communication skills and actually apply it to this new position. And that new position involves a lot of communication because we are on the path of transforming, of modernizing our company. And this company, being a very old one, almost over 100 years of history, very conservative, oil and gas, obviously energy sector, you really need to do your best to persuade people, to catch their attention, to convince them, to energize them that the modernization or the way we're accepting new things and new mindsets is the only way to go if we want to thrive, not only survive, but thrive as a company. So that particular conversation I remember very well. And I think it really kind of got stuck in my brain that communication is absolutely at the core. It is the core of successful leadership.
Yeah, and it is. And as I referenced that quote, our words, our communications really do create the worlds that we exist in, and it's critical. So let me ask you a little bit about. Let's talk now a little bit about the impact of COVID-19. And so first, before we talk about that impact, remind us a little bit of what are the fundamentals of effective communication, just in general. And because I think one of the interesting things is that, there are a lot of trends that were going on before COVID-19 hit, and so a lot of those things will carry through. COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of trends, but let's start with the fundamentals. What are the basics of effective communication?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. That's a great question because this is what I usually say to people because I've been doing this these dialogues and conversations now across the world. Both with companies and in my own company, trying to help people understand what has changed in communication, in interpersonal communication, and how we can adapt. And I think the first thing I usually start from is, ladies and gentlemen, communication is as old as humankind. We've always communicated. It wasn't like something new age or whatever. Yeah, of course, the research into communication maybe dates back to 200 years ago. But communication has been with us forever, as long as we have been around the earth. Yeah. So obviously, some principles have remained, and they will remain. They will remain no matter what happens. So let me share with you those principles. And by the way, they're not my principles. They're actually research-based. And I can even quote one particular researcher. His name was Jay Conger, and he published an article in Harvard Business Review back in the year 2000. And that article was called The Necessary Art of Persuasion. If I'm not mistaken, The Necessary Art of Persuasion. A very famous article. And basically in that article, Jay Conger claims that there are 4 elements to any persuasive communication. And by the way, just for everybody, when we say persuasive communication, we don't just talk about sales or convincing somebody to change his mind. It's a broad concept. It's really about, in my view, effective communication. So just read this as, what is it? What does it take to do effective communication? So he came up with 4 ideas or 4 principles. Number 1, empathy. And we'll talk about empathy. I think we need to get back to that topic separately. But empathy. Can you really put yourself into somebody else's shoes? That's how I understand empathy in the simplest sort of words. Second principle was providing evidence. And by the way, it's not just about hard evidence based on fact. It's about how you provide the evidence. Are you using various channels? Are you just using verbal channels? Or do you present something visually? Or do you actually bring a demo, like a product, into the audience and let the people touch, smell, play with it? So that was the second one, providing evidence. Third was finding a common ground. And actually, let me just step back just for a second. I've recently had a conversation with Anand Sharma, who I'm sure a lot of people on this call know personally. And Dr. Sharma was very gracious by giving me his advice on what it takes in his perspective to actually be a persuasive communicator. And he said the single most important rule that I've learned in my life was, drum roll, find a common ground. And that is a third principle of effective or persuasive communication. So to me, it was just such a brilliant, serendipity that Dr. Sharma was saying exactly what the research says. You've got to find common ground if you want to persuade somebody, if you want to be effective. And finally, the last element is about establishing credibility. And we can talk about it separately because it's a big topic in itself. But it's basically about, do you really do what you say you're doing? And do you really kind of walk the walk? Not only talk the talk, but walk the walk.
Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, the serendipity with Anand Sharma about the common ground just goes to your point that these are nothing new. This has been a fundamental of good communication forever. And so I think that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting to me is as you went through those four things, it reminded me of some of the research I've come across in psychology where they talk about when somebody meets you for the first time, they're really assessing you on two dimensions. One is basically, can I trust this person? And that has to do with warmth, and that relates back to your empathy. And the second one is it worth investing time with this person? In other words, are they competent? Are they, and that kind of gets back to your credibility and trust. And so, again, as we started out, sometimes communication is difficult enough in person, but obviously it's all the harder when you're doing it at a distance. So let's talk about, how do you project empathy or, the warmth and empathy that's so important in relationships over distances. And then we'll come and talk about credibility and how you adapt in this COVID-19 world to project that as well. So start us off, empathy. How do we do that?
Yeah. So I guess my answer to this will be was a few caveats, and obviously let's start with a simple, very important truth that is impossible to deny, and that is nothing can replace, at least as far as we can judge today, nothing can replace physical contact. That is the act of being in the same room with your counterpart, with your audience, sensing the energy, sharing the energy, looking at the cues, reading the body language. I mean, even literally feeling the chemistry, the vibe. It's impossible. So let's just make this very clear to the audience. There is no way of 100% replacing that physical proximity, right? So if we say that, second thing that I can say is it actually depends. If you know somebody, like I know Bill and Bill knows me, it is so much easier for both of us, Bill, now to be empathetic to one another, to understand one another online while we're still hundreds and maybe thousands of kilometers away. Even when certain things are buried under the camera or whatever outside our view, and sometimes there may be a problem with our connection, etc. I think it's much more difficult when you meet somebody for the first time online. Now, that is something that I personally struggle with, let alone pretending to say that I know the answer to the cure for it. But I still will try to tell you what I've found over the past almost 3 months now. Feels like it's been forever, but I think it's about 3 or maybe a bit more than 3 months that I've been locked down and everybody was basically worked on remote. I think what I found is if you psychologically treat the online encounter as you would treat a real physical encounter, that is with the same level of commitment, the same level of serious approach, the same level of preparation for this meeting, it will actually pay off. And let me just illustrate it. There's like a couple of very simple things. You would want somebody to listen to you to demonstrate that they're active listeners and they're in there and they're all absorbed, or just like our dear friend John King likes to say, are you all in, right? We want to be all in. Well, you got to be all in online as well. If you shutting down your camera because you want to text somebody, if you're putting your microphone on mute because you want to talk to somebody else, obviously that is not good communication. And this goes back to, by the way, Bill, in my view, to the point of both competence and confidence. I mean, do you really say what you're going to do? Do you really do what you're going to say you're going to do? I mean, how reliable you are. And that issue of reliability and trust now will be very, very important, because it's such a tiny ice that we're treading on right now. It's so easy to break that ice, because in a physical space, you can easily cover it up, but not in here. So my general recommendation for the online people, for people going online, is treat this as if you were in a real physical meeting. Be serious, be professional, be all in. That would be my best recommendation.
Okay, good. And so talk a little bit about how do you demonstrate the competence part and providing evidence and finding the common ground. Talk a little bit about that in the context of the COVID-19 world, and we might want to distinguish a little bit between opportunities like we're having now for a video conference conversation versus just having to do it through email or WhatsApp or other types of technology that don't have the video.
Yeah. So Bill, I think you're kind of opening up a big door now. So there's a few things there, a few things in your question that I can pick. And let me just start with something, and then you let me know if I've gone astray or if I'm on the topic. So first of all, let me say a few words about what COVID-19 has done to us. Okay. Now, I'm sure that you guys will agree with me. I mean, it's pandemic, it's everywhere, so I'm not going to give you any news there, but I still want to make sure we are on the same page. So in my view, there are a couple of things that COVID-19 has created specifically to communication. Number one, social distancing. I think it's pretty much rule all over the world. You got to keep your distance. Some say up to 2 meters, 1 meter, doesn't matter. It's distance. No handshakes, no hugs. And we all love hugs in SIBF academies, right? That's all about being close and showing empathy. No more hugs, no more handshakes. The country I was born in, I grew up in Azerbaijan, and again, I'm sure people on the call will have known that as well. We love to show our emotions, and for us, a handshake is an absolute essential part of our communication. Now, imagine you're seeing a friend after having seen him or her for a couple of months, and you can't shake his hand or her hand. That is a serious issue, and I'm not joking about it. It is serious psychological shift. You got to really live with this. And I've already done it a few times when I'm running to somebody, I want to shake hand. Oh, no, I can't do that. No. And that's like it breaks your stereotypes. It breaks your principles. Second thing is about being out of office. Just think about it. Bill, I guess you're probably in your apartment or your home, right? Yes. I'm in my home right now. I'm in my apartment. You can guess from the lighting and from the wallpaper. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call are probably most likely in their apartments or their homes. Now, I'm not sure about you, Bill, but I'm not used to living and working in my apartment for now almost fourth months in a row, nonstop. Of course, I did some stuff from home, but never for such a long time. So that is a complete change in the way I communicate, right? I'm missing the office buzz. I'm missing the water cooler conversations, the coffee conversations, the rumors, whatever, everything, it's just gone, right? That's part of communication. That's the grapevine. The grapevine is important. So a third thing is 24/7 housemates. Now, of course, don't get me wrong. I love my wife. I love my kids. I got 2 kids. One is 11 and the other is 4. But I don't think when I got married, I signed up for living with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 or 4 months at a time. So in a sense, all jokes aside, that's tough. It's really tough. And I'm happy for everybody on the call just to chip in the chat boxes, sharing with me and with Bill if they feel they have similar kind of troubles. And the fourth element is cabin fever. Not just about being with your loved ones, but being physically in one location among, I don't know, between four walls, locked down. And you're lucky if you have a house with a garden where you can step out and maybe do some gardening. A lot of people in my country, in Azerbaijan, we live in apartments. That's basically it. It's just a couple of rooms and you're locked there for a long time. So anyway, those four elements are extremely important for us to understand what really changes and tweaks our communication, right? So now, if you're asking me, what's the recommendation? Can we do something about it? Is there a way out? I'm just going to say one thing, and then I'll hand over to you, Bill, and you can sort of maybe go on with a few more specifying questions. I think the number one thing I want everybody to really absorb and appreciate in this COVID-19 world, that would be my number one principle for effective communication, is no surprise here, by the way, it is empathy. It is empathy. And by empathy, and I'm not going to go into details because I'm sure people on the call have already heard, read, and maybe even worked in the field of showing empathy and being empathetic. But the idea is, Bill, just consider this particular fact. I'm sure that people on this call, just by the sheer fact that they all joined the call, that they're all with us, I'm pretty confident that they are all safe and sound and in their homes and everything is fine with them, and probably they're okay in terms of they can feed their families and they're fine. Now, think about those hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have been affected by COVID-19, lost their jobs, lost their loved ones. Should have probably started from that. Lost their loved ones. That's just unbelievable heartbreaking. Or lost their jobs, okay, or lost something else, business, etc. Can you really understand the plight they are in right now? Can you really sense that? That's what I mean by empathy. If we don't show that empathy today, if we don't feel for what our fellow human beings outside, not just our friends, not just our family members, but fellow human beings outside, what they experience, then I'd say don't even start me on anything else, because everything else is just a toolbox. It's just a toolbox. But the key principle is, unless you can open your heart and feel the pain of other people, there is no really effective communication. I'll shut up here. I think I've talked too much. Over to you, Bill.
No, it's all very, very interesting, very helpful. So, do you have any tips, like when you're preparing for a call? Okay, what thought process do you go through? What are some of the things you think about doing in advance? How do you prepare so that you can be more effective online and establish that empathy? How is it different preparing for online calls than it would be for offline in-person meetings?
So Bill, here's my take on it. Number one, well, I already mentioned, treat this as you would treat any physical meeting. That is, be there all in. Do not do shortcuts. Do not think about, it's just an online meeting. I'll kind of, get my pajamas on and get my coffee mug and, just do something. No, it's really serious. You take it seriously, just like you would any other meeting. I think what shapes it up for me, the way I prep for my conversations, even for this particular webinar, which I've done already many times, but it doesn't matter. What I usually do is I give myself ample time for preparation. I don't just hit this thing cold. And you and I, Bill, we know that it wasn't just, you called me and said, Rashad, would you be available a couple of days from now? Let's do a call. We actually took this seriously. We at least, Aisha and I and you and three of us, we spoke about it. We discussed what kind of questions will be interesting for the audience. We talked about the format. That's a lot of prep work for something that I'm sure you and I could have done even without preparation. But I think in my view, that shows the respect we have for the audience. So I probably translate the same things to our audience, is treat your audience with respect, prepare seriously for whatever you're going to deliver. And maybe I have three specific recommendations for online presentations, which I think are very important. Is number one, and actually there's three words to just remember: structure, be structured, be succinct, and be visual. So three rules, three principles that are absolutely essential for online presentations. Doesn't matter if you're doing a webinar or you're talking to a colleague or a client. So let's take them one by one very quickly. So number one, being structured. Structure for me means this. Remember that in the times of crisis and adversity and chaos, the key thing to bring everybody back to earth is structure. And you know why, Bill? Because structure means predictability. And predictability is what people crave for. What we hate is ambiguity. And I'm sure everybody will kind of get a sense. You don't even need to be a researcher to understand, oh yeah, I wouldn't want to be ambiguous about things. Oh, I would like to be, sure about what. So that's why structure is this. Guys, we're going to have a 10 minutes meeting today. I'm going to go over this, and this with you. Are you ready? That's it. That's a structured approach. Number two, succinct. Again, Bill, you and I know that the most expensive, the most difficult commodity in today's world is what? Attention. Attention. So how do you deal with that deficit of attention? You have to be succinct. You have to be quick, specific. So in my view, you want to make a point? Spend a minute and a half. Spend 2 minutes. No more than that. Don't go rumbling your way through a long speech, going back and forth, going on tangents. Specific, to the point. And number three, being visual. And again, that's just one example. We're having a video conference, right? I mean, I know it's a very simple one, but we need to see somebody. Or if you want to talk to a client or a customer, bring up a few slides, but please, for God's sake, do not use bullet points on that slide. Use a graph, use a chart, use a photograph, but do not use bullet points, because bullet points are not going to really help the other side unless you're, doing some contractual agreement or something. So again, let me just recover and I'll hand over to you, Bill. So 3 recommendations: be structured. 1, 2, 3. Be succinct. 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes per point, and you're done with it. And be visual. Show graphs, show charts, show photographs to make a point.
Very good. Very succinct too. So that kind of opens up a lot of different questions in my mind. There's the old saw about, if you tell me I have 90 minutes to give a speech, I can start right now. If I have 45 minutes, I need 3 or 4 days. If I have 5 minutes, I need, a week to prepare. And so it goes back to preparation. If you're going to be succinct, you really need to be prepared. You can't just jump on the call. So I think that's important. But I'd like to explore a little bit with you about the visual part. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is by doing the video, you have visual. But a lot of times it's not about that. It may be you're sending a document or email. And so I'm kind of curious because, your evolution in history was about public speaking or public communication, face-to-face. Now, more and more, we're seeing books and recommendations about visual communication, visual teams, visual this, visual that. Is this something that you're kind of focusing on? You're trying to incorporate more in what you do as visuals?
So let me see if I can answer that question the way you intended it. So the way I understand this question is, what kind of shift have we now been observing in the way public speech or presentation has gone through? So previously, say literally just a year back, online speeches or webinars would certainly be quite an expected thing, but not a mainstream thing. Now they are the mainstream thing. In fact, arguably, they are the only thing, because there's nothing else really right now, at least right now. God willing, we will emerge from this, but right now it's nothing else but online presence and online presentations. So I think, in my view, the way I understand this transformation from public speaking in physical presence of an audience to a public or online speaking in absence of the audience, or in the online audience, which of course is absolutely there and is respected, but not really visible, touchable, kind of sensible. It's just basically, in my right now view, and I'm sure as in yours, Bill, it's just a bunch of little taglines with names of people. I mean, I can see you, but it still feels a bit awkward. It still feels a bit, raw, not really seeing your audience, not really sensing their. I think number one complaint that I have seen from a lot of leaders that I've been working with in the last couple of months is we cannot speak online. And by the way, mind you, Bill, these are people who have experience speaking. So these are not novices. These are experienced people. They say, Rashad, we cannot focus. We cannot present powerfully because we do not see audience feedback. And I underline the word, we do not see the audience feedback. Because arguably you can ask for feedback like we do with our audience. I mean, I've already seen that there's a bunch of chat room comments there, but you can't really see the feedback. And a lot of leaders say that, I can't do it. Oh, thank you, Bobby. Now we see the feedback. So a lot of leaders complain that they cannot be as forthcoming, as emotional, as showing empathy, because they just talk to a wall. They just talk to a little web camera, and it just doesn't cut it. So in my view, Bill, just to summarize is, I think what it will take in the future, if this continues for a long time, and it sounds like it will continue for, unfortunately, a long time, is leaders need to learn a new skill of actually, literal, and I mean technical skill of talking to a camera, a web camera or a computer camera, an iPad camera. And I think, I mean, from my experience of being in the press office of my company, I remember doing a number of interviews with companies like BBC and CNN. I mean, professionals of BBC and CNN who would come to our country and actually took a bunch of our young people, including myself from BP, and would do trainings with us, teaching us how to talk to a camera. And I don't mean just a camera with a cameraman. I mean just a camera without anybody. And that is something that a lot of people thought about as, oh, that's just for the media people. Not anymore. Not anymore. It's for a lot of people now. Just learn to talk to the camera and pretend that somebody's looking at you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's fascinating how all of this is evolving, and like you say, all the new skills we have to pay attention to, and so that was something I may come back to later after we bring our audience into this, and I'd like to do that now. Now, so Rashad, I know you had suggested a couple of polls that, to get some feedback with the audience, and so I think Aisha in the background has put one of these polls together. So if you would, on your screen, you should see the poll question. Which of these have posed the biggest challenge to you? It's multiple choice: social distancing, being out of office, 24/7 housemates, cabin fever. And then there's a second poll: which of these principles of persuasive communication do you find most relevant to you in your life today? Demonstrating empathy, providing evidence, finding a common ground, establishing credibility. So let's. The poll is open. Please go ahead and make your selections. And we're seeing a lot of the input coming in. So right now, social distancing seems to be the biggest challenge by far. Housemates is kind of in second place. Cabin fever third. Nobody seems to. A couple of people missing out at the office. Not too many yet. That's an interesting thing. I'll make a quick comment about that. I happened to be talking to our insurance company guy, our rep, and we were just chatting about they're delaying payments, giving people more time, and so on and so forth. And so anyway, we started chatting. He was telling me one of his clients is the head of HR at Toyota, which just opened this giant regional headquarters in North Dallas. And he said that when COVID hit, they had everybody go home and sequester, and they discovered productivity shot up. And now they're having this big debate. What do we do? Do we make everybody come back and see productivity go down? Now, there's lots of reasons to think that may have been a temporary blip, and it may not be sustainable, and so on and so forth. But it's kind of an interesting, observation that a lot of people really enjoy being out of the office and actually can be more productive, at least have been recently. So why don't we, if you haven't had a chance to enter your opinions into the polls, please do that. We're going to wrap that up and sort of see what our final results are. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and let's see what the results look like. So in terms of the biggest challenges people face, by far 60%, it's the social distancing. And it's kind of interesting that it's been depicted as social distancing, because a lot of people are arguing that it's really physical distancing and that we can still be socially close by being online. But nonetheless, 60% of people said that. In second place are housemates driving us up the wall, 20%, and then cabin fever, 16%, and being out of office, 8%. And so I might ask, if you don't mind, in the chat, you might just kind of share with us, are you still locked down in your country, or are you opening up in your country so that you can get out a little bit more? So that might be interesting to see what people have to say. Let's talk about which of the principles of persuasive communication are most relevant. And by a slight majority, demonstrating empathy came in at 52%. Providing evidence was last place at 8%. Common ground, 24%, and credibility, 16%. So finding common ground is so important, but it's not as challenging as the empathy based on this audience. So what do you think about these results? What insights do you get from that?
You're asking me, Bill, or do you talk to the audience?
I'm talking to you.
Okay. So, well, they're not surprising. I mean, I'm not surprised about the second poll when empathy ranks highest in terms of the most relevant. Now, I mean, I really, from the bottom of my heart, and I mean it, that unless you can empathize with people today, forget everything else. Everything else is secondary, because everything else is a toolbox, and it's an important toolbox. Don't get me wrong; it's important to know how to listen well, how to show your body language correctly, how to raise your voice. All of these are critical. I mean, I teach people how to do it, but everything pales in comparison with true empathy. If you really can show empathy, you don't really have to be a fantastic speaker or a communicator. You already communicate a lot just by showing empathy. If you can't show empathy, you know how we call those people, right? Who don't show empathy and then they're good communicators. They're just manipulators. That's how you call them. Because what they do is they take advantage of the situation, right? So that's why I'm not surprised by that kind of attitude that empathy ranks very high in terms of the relevance. As for the social distancing versus other things, Bill, I think you're right in saying that social distancing may not be the right term for it. I mean, that's a term that everybody uses, but I agree it's more about physical distance between myself and anybody else, a neighbor, a counterpart, or a colleague. But it does take its toll in a sense that no matter how much online communication you have, and with somebody like you, Bill, who is thousands of kilometers from Baku, I can understand that it's probably the only way for me to communicate with you on a regular basis. But when you can't see your close friends, close relatives, colleagues, and depends clients, customers. I mean, there's a bunch of you really come to a point, and I have certainly come to that point when you feel stressed. To use a simple word, stressed. You just physically, you're not feeling well about it. You feel that something's wrong. Something is just not good, not right, and it takes its toll on the way you communicate. And I think, Bill, you probably agree that amount of stress that this drives is almost proportional to the amount of household aggression, and I mean potentially depression and any other sort of things that can come up on top of that pent up sort of demand for communication.
So let's, if you don't mind, let me now start introducing some of the questions from our audience.
And also comments, please. Maybe some interesting comments.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to look a little distracted as I look at the comments and so on and so forth. So my intention is not to be not all in. But Mohammed Al-Tamani has been very, very active with lots of different questions. And so he references, basically one of his questions has to do with how do you deal with a situation when you're in a situation or experience where you don't really agree with the people you're having to interact with? He referenced your experience with OCSE, which I don't know if you want to go into that or not. But basically, the question is, you're in your role at BP, you're dealing with all these different countries. You get a situation, it's a challenge. You're not really comfortable with it. How do you deal with those challenges? Or communication, goes awry. How do you recover from that?
Okay, well, first of all, Mohammed, hello to you. I think I met Mohammed 2 years ago at Mela in Muscat, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So great to have you with us. And I think the question makes a lot of sense because it's so easy to talk about communicating effectively. But then remember, I think as a famous saying by Mike Tyson is, everybody has a plan until you get a punch in the face. So what do you do when you get a punch in the face? And in my view, the way I handle it is there's a few principles. Now, listen, this is not research-based. It's just my personal experience. I would say number one is show humility. Show humility. Demonstrate humility. And what I mean by that is this. We are all human, and humans are prone to errors. We do make mistakes on both sides, both the listeners and the speakers. I think if you feel that a particular conversation goes into what's the expression, the rat hole, if a particular conversation goes on a wrong tangent, if your counterpart starts being impatient or whatever else happens there, show humility. And by that I mean, do not ever make an assumption that the other side is wrong. I'm going to repeat this. Do not make an assumption that the other side is wrong. Oh, you're not listening. Oh, you don't understand. Oh, wait a minute. Let me tell you how it works. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, you didn't know that? Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not humility. That is actually showing that you're kind of a little smarter than the other side, which in reality, remember, nobody knows. There is no guarantee that you are right or he is wrong or she's wrong. So always show humility. And when you show humility, what it really means, Bill, in my view, Mohammed, since Mohammed is asking this question, it's about you should be able to demonstrate that you are persuadable. You should say, you know what? Help me understand. Don't say, oh, let me explain to you. Say, oh, help me understand. And if you actually open up that window, if you say, you know what? I'm going to accept that I may be wrong, or that I may not understand something, or I may be not quite fully up to date on the context. So help me understand, help me fill that gap. And a lot of times I've used it many, many times in my life. I'm not saying it's 100% bulletproof technique, but I can tell you a lot of times people actually do say, oh, let me explain to you. And then they open up because they see that you opened up. It's just quid pro quo, it's just you're reaching out and the other side is reaching out. I hope that answers the question, but to me, that's a fundamental approach to dealing with any misunderstanding in any communication.
No, I think that's really insightful. In fact, you've got oh wow, that's fascinating. I'm persuadable. That's gold. That's you got that comment from Mohammed, so that's really nice. It also reminds me. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Bungay Stanier. He wrote a couple of famous books that have been big sellers. But anyway, he has a new book out, and it's Taming Your Advice Monster or something like that. But basically, we all have this approach of when we're in a conversation, it's about my advice to you, and this whole idea of being humble, being more curious, I think is really, really valuable. And it kind of also reminds me a little bit about vulnerability. Some people see it as weakness, but actually showing that you're vulnerable, i.e. you can be persuaded, it actually brings people closer together, as you suggested. And so I think that's really a powerful comment. Ruwani was asking a question about what do you do when you have a team that is really tough to break through because they're very guarded, very formal, very reserved in their communication. So I I notice sometimes things get interrupted and video goes off, so good to have you back. But anyway, so how do you deal with those situations? You have a team it's really hard to draw them out so that you can create that connection, establish that empathy.
Thank you, Bill. I think it kind of goes along the lines of what I've just said before, and it all builds on empathy. And what I mean it all builds on empathy is leaders should be role models for the type of behavior they expect from their team and staff and what have you. So if I want my team to be communicating freely, I need to create an aura, an atmosphere, a room for that kind of free exchange of information, free flow of information. I've had a lot of cases when my team member, and I really mean like my team members back in my home, back in my work, been shy and silent and not really talkative. So sometimes what I would do is I would invite them through a question, basically, okay, well, Muhammad, I haven't heard you express an opinion on this topic, but I'm sure you knowing you for a long time, that you probably also have an opinion on it. So what is your take on it? So just being gently pulling them into the conversation versus waiting for them to open up. Second thing, and that's probably not in the order of importance, just kind of off the top of my head. Second thing is being able to have some quality time with those people as part of your one-on-ones, part of your catch-ups, part of your performance conversations, and really help them open up. Because usually, and again, I've seen it in my life many times, people who are shy in front of other people, when they are in a face-to-face conversation with their boss, they can open up a little better than in front of, say, a third party or another person. So I've had many conversations when I said to my team members, well, tell me about your communication preferences. What is it, or how is it that you like to communicate, to exchange information? Are you more of a, for example, WhatsApp person, or you more of a face-to-face person, or you more of an email person? And that conversation kind of kicks off the ball on the types and preferences and channels of communication. So in my view, again, just to wrap it up, number one, please always bring the silent voice into the room. Do not wait for him or her to talk. That's number one. Number two, spend some quality time with your team members. And I've done it many times, and it always helps to almost talk them through the way they communicate. What is it that makes it easier for them? What is it that creates an obstacle for them right now? And I can guarantee through those two tools, you'll be able to get something.
Great. And that reminds me a little bit of, if you're familiar with Oscar Trimboli and this whole deep listening movement that he started. And one of the key elements of deep listening is basically listen for the unsaid. And and so be sure everybody's had an opportunity to participate, or pause and get comfortable with silence to give people time to process and so they can get all their thoughts out. So I think that's really good advice, and I found it to be very effective as well.
By the way, that's what journalists do. That's what professional journalists do with their interviewees, is they actually keep silent after asking a question and after the answer is given, because they think that by that silence, they will make the other side slightly uncomfortable to feel in the silence. And that's really a psychological phenomenon, because people are really shying away from silence. There will be a need to fill it in.
Yeah, and so that's good. Now we've been, since you talked about, basically humility and so on, there's been a lot of back and forth in the chat about the trade-off between, being persuadable versus maintaining control. And, control is a big issue now, more and more in this complicated world we live in. It's, the traditional idea that the leader has all the answers is just less practical in these days, because there's so much going on and you need leaders at all different levels because they're closer to what's happening, but yet you are the leader. And so talk a little bit about how you balance, empathy and vulnerability against maintaining control of the conversation and direction of the communication.
So that's an excellent question, Bill. And the reason I say it is excellent because it actually touches on something very modern and hip, if you will, and that is this whole concept of agile leadership, or being adaptive leadership. Another word for adaptive leadership. And I think, and this is something I think, Bill, you asked me at the very, very beginning of what do I do in BP, being a modernization and transformation lead. It is actually my job to help leaders to embrace the principles of adaptive leadership. And very, very quickly, because I don't want to, that's a whole separate topic in itself. But if I just give you like a 1-minute explanation how I see it, is adaptive leadership is about basically being agile, that is nimble, just like a good athlete will be. A good athlete, he or she has agility in her body, so he or she can actually move her body very quickly, depending on a response coming from, say, the other athlete or the circumstances, and be slightly faster than the opponent, right? So for me, adaptive leadership is about two things. It's actually how you are enabling things and how you are disrupting things. So enabling part is something we've talked about, showing empathy, empowering people, right? That's again, I hope it's pretty clear for a lot of people. Now, what is disruption? How do you disrupt and actually be really a force for good? Well, the idea about disruption is this. We often live in the world which we create for ourselves through habits. And habits are with us forever. And we tend to believe that this world we live in is the only world, is the only reality, is the only correct way to live, or the only correct way to do things. And disruption is, in my view, a better word than control. Because let me tell you this, I don't really believe in control anymore in a sense of a modern workplace. Or control in an old, archaic way, I don't think it any longer makes any sense. But disruption does. And disruption, an example of disruption is learning new ways of working. Pushing your teams to start doing things differently. And of course, being a role model in that. Going against a status quo. Asking questions. That's the best way I've ever seen people being disruptive in meetings. Asking tough questions. So, in summary, just to give you a quick answer, number one is continue to show empathy, continue to empower people. That's about enabling. But at the same time, don't forget that if you really want to be adaptive, you also need to break things. You need to break the mold. You need to break silos. You need to challenge status quo. And you do that through good questions. You do it through saying things which actually go to the contrary of the mainstream ideas. You do it through actually learning new ways of working and teaching your team to do it in a different way. I hope that kind of gives the sense of what I meant by this.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. We have an interesting question from Peruteo. How do we confirm the audience's understanding if there's a group and you're in an online call? So what are some, we did a poll, you asked for the chat. So it also kind of goes on and says, I've made communications with my team for the sake of transparency for tough news. Some liked the transparency and some got frightened, which is not what I wanted them to feel. So how do you manage that? So you're giving tough news. You don't have a chance to kind of follow up in person. What are some thoughts on that?
Bill, and thank you for the question. So I didn't get the name Peru, you said?
Teo, yeah, Peruteo. I'm not sure. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I apologize if I'm not.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for asking this question. It's another one of those when you hit the wall. When the challenge comes up. How do you deal with that? I think the usual mantra that I hear nowadays is, if you have a team meeting, and that's a very specific advice, so just take it for its face value. At its face value, when you have a meeting, I always encourage my team members to put their cameras on. Even if there's 5 or 6 or 7 people, everybody put your cameras on. And the reason I say it is that it gives me a chance, a slight chance, not a big, but a slight chance to catch, maybe, but through the window of my eye, just to catch couple of reactions of the audience when I talk or when somebody else talks. So cameras on, to me, is one way to handle it. Now, second is, I think Bill and Aisha has done a great job. They've actually made a poll, right? Just a simple poll, a question that gauges the reaction of the audience to a certain thing. And the reason polls are good because they're anonymous. I mean, nobody's going to be held accountable for thinking that social distancing is a challenge or that cabin fever is not a challenge. You kind of get the temperature check of the audience. So my team is really pro this option and not pro this option. Honestly, in my view, silent voting is the only true voting, because everything else is just groupthink. I don't want to get a new conversation going, but to me, it's just a group thing. You see somebody voting like that, like Bill raises his hand, and then Rashad raises his hand, and then Aisha chimes in, and all of a sudden, 20 seconds later, everybody votes for just because the most respected guy in the audience, Bill, said yes. Silent voting is actually true voting when people express their true opinion. So just go for silent voting. Go for those kind of polls. And a third element that I would go for is, do not forget that you need to still have one-on-one catch-ups with your team members on a regular basis. Now, I'm not saying you should do it every day. That's probably out of the question. Maybe every week. Well, at least every 2 weeks. And in those one-on-ones, please, please, please probe for understanding. Just listen. Don't ask questions to be given an update. Ask an open-ended question. Well, how do you feel about our communication? How do you feel about this last 2 weeks? Has it been working okay for you? Do you feel under stress? And get the other person talk. And I guarantee to you that if there is any misunderstanding, it will come up as you get those one-on-ones really seriously, honestly, empathetically so.
Yep. And I like your reference to questions. I think that's a really incredibly valuable skill is the ability to ask good questions. I think that really helps tremendously. We had a question or a comment about humor and using humor in communications. Talk a little bit about that. Sometimes people are very effective with it. Sometimes it can backfire. What are your thoughts on using humor?
Well, you asked the wrong guy, Bill, because I love you.
What do you mean? You're the stand-up comic guy. Come on.
Okay. Quote unquote. I love humor. I told you, stand-up comedy is part of my life. At some point in time, hard to believe, but I was on the verge of dropping everything and just doing stand-up comedy for a living. But I don't know if it was or if it could be a right way to go. But all jokes aside, comedy and humor and sense of humor are, to me, indispensable in the time of distress. And today, the entire world is in a state of distress, is in a state of very large discomfort. So when I'm in meetings, I always use my sense of humor. I'm not saying I am very humorous, but my sense of humor to sometimes drop just a little droplet, into this big bowl of mixed feelings and emotions and problems and issues. And if you can get your team to, crack and laugh and smile at least for a couple of seconds over something, that is taking a lot of stress out of the system. So I'm a strong believer in humor being the best remedy for stress. So absolutely, humor should be used. If you can't make good jokes, learn to make them.
Do you have any advice about, should you shy away from dark side humor or
obviously, humor is very contextual. So if I make a joke in Azerbaijan, that is going to be extremely laughable for Azerbaijanis. It may be slightly uncomfortable for somebody outside Azerbaijan, simply because that particular topic is a taboo topic in that country. So cultural and cross-cultural relevance and cross-cultural, tolerance, it's very important. You need to understand and appreciate it, especially nowadays we all live and work in multicultural environments. But nevertheless, of course, obviously, I mean, if you're asking me, Bill, try not to joke about politics or religion, obvious, or doing gender sensitive or gender insensitive, probably that's the right word, gender insensitive jokes. That would be a very bad thing to do. But if you just want to, say something funny that happened to you, or if you want to comment with a little off the cuff comment on somebody else's position. If you've gained confidence, if you've gained trust with your team, I think it should be comfortable for you to do that. Again, I don't want to make it a scientific conversation right now. What is the right level of humor and tolerance and everything? Just trust your senses and your knowledge of the culture and use it cautiously, but use it. Do make use of humor to relieve the stress.
Oh, good. So maybe kind of start to wrap up now. We have an interesting question from Arzu Abdullayeva, and she's asking, as a general question, not specifically to online communication, but as a general question, how do you judge or measure effective communication? And I want to put this in a broader context because coaching has become more and more popular. You're a coach for people on presentations and speaking and so on and so forth. But you, as your own, as a speaker yourself, do you have a coach? And what do you do to continue to develop yourself and monitor your skills? And so, how do you measure effective communication in general?
Thank you, Arzu, and thank you, Bill, for this clarification as well. In my view, there is one important measurement for effective communication, and that is, remember that any communication can be effective only if both sides, and that's minimum, right? There are at least two sides to any communication. If both sides have common understanding of what has been communicated. So, in other words, if I talk to you, Bill, but then I don't get feedback from you of that is going to be my gauge for how well you understood me, that is not effective communication. If there is feedback, if there is a two-way street, if there is a loop in that mechanism of our talk, of our discussion, and if I gauge through that loop, through that feedback mechanism, through that feedback loop that, oh yes, Bill understood what I've just said, what I've just uttered, that's by definition is effective communication. Okay, that's for the effective communication as a principle. Now, how do you stay in shape? How do you stay fit as a communicator? Well, let me tell you what I do, and I don't know whether that's going to be fair or not, but that's just what I can share without being too academic about it. Obviously, guys, I can tell you, read books, watch YouTube videos. Yeah, you all know it, and I'm sure some of you do it as well. What helps me to stay fit, Bill and Arzu, is constant application of my knowledge. In other words, I do not ever stop presenting. Now, obviously, I don't present every day, but in a sense, when there is nothing to present about, I create those opportunities for myself. So for example, if I have no clients for some particular reason, for a certain period of time, and I'm just exaggerating, I'm idle and I don't have anything else to do, I would come up with an idea, I would create an opportunity, and I would use it to communicate with people. And the reason I say it is because it's just like language skills. Anybody on this call who has ever learned a second language knows perfectly well, and I am one of them, that unless you use your second language constantly, consistently, you will not keep the same level, irrespective of what school you've gone to, or how many books you read, how many YouTube videos you watched. If you do not practice what you've learned, it's just forever. It's gone. So that's why I say every opportunity you have, look at every opportunity as your golden ticket. Don't shy away. On the contrary, go for it. Say, I want to speak. I want to present. May I be the person to present? And that's what you're going to learn. As for the sources, my personal favorite, Bill, is TEDx, or to be correct, TED as a platform. TEDx is just kind of a variation of it, basically. So TED as a platform, I have probably watched in my life, around 300 to 400. I don't know, I didn't really count them, but between 300 to 400 videos on TED, and every single one of them has been insightful. Every single one of them has taught me not only the content of the speech, but also how to speak. So that would be my recommendation to everybody. Number one, go out and speak. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You fall and you get up. You fall and you get up. The key is to get up. after you fall. And number two, watch TED. If you just pick one platform, go for TED. You will learn so much from brilliant speakers, brilliant researchers, brilliant individuals, as well as you will see how many different styles of communication are out there.
Do you have a favorite TED Talk or favorite speaker or speak?
I love a couple of them done by Simon Sinek. I'm sure, Bill, you probably also have seen them. I love the one by Amy Cuddy. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to actually share a list of some of them with you, and then you can share with people on the call. I won't be able to give all the names now, but Amy Cuddy and Simon Sinek are definitely some of the best that I've seen.
And again, to be clear about the point you're making, it's one thing to hear the content, and they're always fantastic. The content's great on TED, but it's to observe the speaker and what they're doing and how they're impacting you is what you're looking for.
Exactly.
Before I finally wrap up, I've got a couple of different questions from a couple of people along the same lines. Like, what is the greatest challenge you face? What's the greatest fall you've had as a speaker, and how did you get up?
Oh gosh, the greatest fall that I had as a speaker. I remember the time when I was on stage, actually literally brought to the stage at a half an hour notice. And when I say this is, when you come on stage, you don't just, to present an audience of 300 people, you don't do it like at somebody else's call. Why don't you come over stage and do something? You prepare for it. You do like, days and hours of presentation preparation. Now, for some reason, I mixed up the dates. And don't ask me how. I guess my mind went blank. I made a mistake by assuming that my presentation is happening like a few days later while it was happening today. And I got a call from an angry coordinator saying, "Rashad, where are you?" I said, "What do you mean where am I? I'm in the city center doing some stuff." So you got to be here in half an hour. And that was probably the most, just unbelievable stress that I lived in. And I took a taxi and I flew there and I went on stage. It was like in a nightmare, worst nightmare. So it was okay. I mean, I did my speech. It was not as good as it could be, but that was okay. It wasn't a failure. The failure was, to me, the lessons learned is everything about speech is important. Not just your presentation, but the whole cycle from the moment you get your order or your request all the way to the feedback of the audience. And it should be orchestrated so well, so precise, so the whole experience doesn't fail because of one single element that you didn't really take care about. So that's why my advice for everybody, take the whole cycle seriously, not just the part where you speak.
Interesting. Yeah, so maybe another thing we might ask you to share with us afterwards to send out to people is, what is that process for you? What are all the different stages in the process of preparing?
Yeah, I'll be happy to share it as well, maybe through a couple of bullet points. But really, Bill, in a nutshell, it's maybe three things I would say. Number one is I always think about the audience. I'll drop the technical parts of getting the order. I'll think about the audience first. I always try to understand as much as I can about who's going to be in the audience. Are these students or professionals? Are these men and women or mixed audience? Are these, say, a younger generation or a bit mature generation? And there are many other elements. I really want to understand as much as I can about my audience. Number two, what's my message? And I mean just one message, like one sentence, like one single line. If I want to leave it in their brain, what is that? If I don't know it, I'm not ready. When I know it, I'm ready. And number three is when I get there, I am all in. And that's what I said. I just quoted our beloved John King. I am completely, fully all in. And the reason I am all in is because I really understand that that's the only way to reach your audience, is to be 100% out there for them so they can sense your energy. And when they sense your energy, they tune in, and then they are okay to listen to your content.
So let me ask you then, in one line, what is your message for this conversation that you want to leave behind with our audience?
Showing empathy is the only way to be an effective communicator in the COVID-19 world.
Very
That's
good.
it. It's only one sentence.
So as we kind of wrap up, a couple last questions. So what's ahead for you, Rashad? What comes next? What are you working on?
Well, thanks for asking, because what I'm working on right now is my book, my second book. I mean, I got one written 4 years ago. I was in public speaking, and now I'm working on a book which is about communicating with influence. I haven't come up with a jazzier title, but the working title is How to Communicate Effectively, or How to Communicate with Influence. And as part of it, actually, I've been doing a number of interviews with a lot of different people who I know from SIBF community. And my guess, my idea there really, Bill, is to write a book which has practical value for everybody who reads it. In other words, I'm not a researcher, and I don't pretend to be a researcher, but I am a practitioner, and I want to write a book of practitioner for people who will be practicing communication with influence. Great.
And one of the things, there's kind of a thread in here that you might want to have in the back of your mind as you're working on your book is one of our participants kind of made this comment about, if on empathy, if you're naturally empathetic, then that's one thing. But if you're kind of trying to be empathetic, is that verging on manipulation and so, kind of thin line there. But anyway, I'll leave that for your book.
Okay. I think it's better to fake it than not to make it. It's better to start faking your empathy, at least, than to just pretend I don't really care. I'm here for business. Here's a deal. I just don't believe that's in any way going to bring you closer to be an effective communicator.
Yeah, a good point. And so, Rashad, just to wrap up, for those of our audience who would like to reach you, get in touch with you, how can they contact you?
Thank you, Bill. They can contact me. I think a lot of people who I see on the call, they are already on my friends on either Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. I usually use this Facebook and LinkedIn quite actively. So please just type my name and my surname, and you'll probably find it either among your friends or directly in your network. And if you can't, I think Aisha has been communicating this kind of pre-webinar little teaser. It should have my contact data as well, or I can share it with you after the call.
Great. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us.
You're welcome.
For another great
presentation. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for moderating this call. And thanks to Aisha for putting this all together.
Yes, I want to shout out to Aisha as well. She's done a fantastic job behind the scenes, as always. And Rashad, thank you so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon on some other occasion. Great job.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who has joined us on this call.
Absolutely. Okay. Take care.
Take care.